theme of Westerns has always been part of Hollywood history, and sometimes this theme included the topic of the American Civil War. So, how accurate was one of the most famous movie stars' costumes during the 1959 movie Horse Soldiers? Thanks for tuning in to Guide Left, Stage Right. I'm your host, The Hide Racer, and you're listening to an episode of Hollywood Film or Historical Fact.
Old Hollywood cavalry movies are filled with bugle calls, gallant saber charges, and lots of yellow stripes. One of the actors who rode tall in the saddle was Marion Robert Morrison. Well, you might know him better as John Wayne. Though quite a few of the cavalry films Wade starred in were U.S. troopers versus Native Americans, one of my favorite movies growing up saw Wayne riding hard through the South during the American Civil War. And this was the 1959 film The Horse Soldiers, which was based on Harold Sinclair's 1956 book of the same name, which in turn was based on a real life American Civil War cavalry raid called Grierson's Raid in 1863. From April 17th to May 2nd of 1863, Union Colonel Benjamin Grierson led a number of Union cavalry and artillery soldiers from LaGrange, Tennessee, down through Mississippi to Baton Rouge. Now, along the way, they wreaked havoc on Confederate war materials and railroads, while also causing the enemy to focus on the raiders, which in turn allowed General Ulysses S. Grant to begin his campaign against Vicksburg. Okay, enough with the raid itself. I'm not going to go too much into the history of that. But now I want to look at Wayne and his character, especially his costume, and see how accurate all of that is. So, Sinclair admitted that while the storyline was based on the historical Grierson's raid, the characters themselves were not taken directly from history. And this is true with Wayne's character of Colonel John Marlowe, who replaces Grierson. Still, let's look at the differences between film and fact. So, earlier in life, the character Marlowe had been a railroad construction engineer whose wife died from a botched surgery. Marlowe then became a hard as nails, rough riding cavalry officer during the war. Well, this is a little different from the real Grierson, who actually was not fond of horses due to when a kid, he was actually kicked in the head by a pony and bore the scar the rest of his life. Now, a fan of music, Grierson actually became a music teacher. But to quote the January 1965 issue of Civil War Times Illustrated, quote, when the war came in 1961 and Lincoln issued the first call for volunteers, Grierson joined an infantry company and went to Cairo, Illinois. While there, he was offered a major's rank in the only service he wished to avoid, the cavalry. Unquote. Another area that Marlowe and Grierson differed was that Grierson's wife lived until 1888 when she was 60 years old. Also, Wayne has no beard, where Grierson actually did. Now, on with the costume. So, first, every cavalryman needs a hat, whether it be a forage cap, kepi, or the traditional slouch hat. And Wayne wears a black slouch hat with a circular dent in the crown. And this may actually be a somewhat fairly decent Hollywood representation for the 1860s. Also, it kind of sort of matches up to where Grierson may have actually worn. There are a set of photos taken after the raid, which shows Grierson with a group of other officers under a brush arbor. And Grierson is indeed wearing a brimmed hat, though its brim is much less wider than that worn by Wayne. Also, though a period issue of Harper's Weekly Journal of Civilization has a drawing of Grierson in a hat even much wider than the film version, this drawing could just be an artist's imagination to capture that cavalry dash for the readers at the time. There also is a tattered hat cord around the Wayne movie brim, but I'm not really sure about the hat Grierson's actually wearing in the photograph taken with other officers. So at the beginning of the movie, the character of Colonel Marlowe is having a meeting with other Union officers, including Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Well, as he's arriving to the meeting place, it's raining, and so he's actually wearing a raincoat. And in this movie, the raincoat does appear to possibly be a piece of canvas covered in rubber, which actually is fairly accurate for the time. And throughout the movie, Wayne around his neck wears a red bandana with white designs, which the bandana looks to be a little more modern because it looks a little smaller than probably the bandanas of the time, which were actually fairly large. But still, I wouldn't say this is necessarily a full blown inaccuracy, even if it's a little smaller, because this is something that sometimes soldiers would have probably carried, especially if you're a cavalryman and you know you're going to be riding in dust. A bandana would have been used to, probably put around your mouth, wipe the dirt off, wipe the sweat off. Of course, again, Wayne's is a little bit small. Now, let's look at Wayne's jacket, which he actually only wears on a few occasions. And this includes a scene where he and some officers are having a photograph taken at the beginning of the movie and also having dinner at a plantation. While the jacket is not 100% accurate, for a Hollywood movie of the time, it actually isn't bad. So, this jacket represents the navy blue wool sack coat generally worn by enlisted men. Now, it is nowhere near a stretch, though, for an officer to be wearing such a jacket. Even General Grant wore one of these when he and Confederate General Robert E. Lee discussed surrender terms. Also, these sack coats generally only historically had 4 buttons. And guess what? The one Wayne wore had only four. Now, I feel like sometimes they give them the later sack coats that had 5 buttons, but Wayne's hits the spot. My biggest complaint about the jacket is the color does not look quite right to me. And I think it's because it's more pointed, almost like a modern dress shirt, whereas the Civil War period ones had a little bit more of a rounded collar to them. But still, overall, I think the coat fairly fits the time period. Now, as to what Grierson actually wore during the raid, I don't know. But I do know that the photographs taken of him after the raid have him wearing an officer's double breasted frock coat. So he might have worn that during the raid or something similar, or it could have been something very simple, such as what Wayne wears. And also, Wayne's coat does have the correct yellow shoulder boards for Union cavalry. I am having a bit of trouble, though, determining exactly what rank is shown on them, but it's either a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, which his character seems to be betraying one of those ranks. Now, in the movie, Wayne does not wear a vest, which is kind of ironic since Wayne usually plays a cowboy and is almost, not always, but almost always wearing a vest. Now, vests were fairly common during the time period, especially civilians going to town. I'm going to guess officers. Now I don't know enlisted men though, or if you were riding hard in the field, would you wear a vest? Uh, and again, Wayne is not wearing one, but in the photograph that Grierson is in, it looks like he is wearing a vest because he actually has his coat unbuttoned and the material underneath and the design of it looks like a vest. So throughout most of the movie, Wayne is wearing a dark blue bib shirt. And a bib shirt is a shirt which is attached on the front via buttons, an extra piece of cloth. And sometimes this cloth will be fairly square, sometimes somewhat angled. Now, this type of shirt does have historical basis. It's also known as a fireman's shirt. Though the cut of the bib is really what determines how accurate this one is. And I'm not going to get too much into that because I have a little trouble myself determining sometimes how accurate the bib is. Now, I do highly doubt, though, that Grierson wore one of these. And even if he did, the insignia shoulder boards are actually on Wayne's shirt in the movie, whereas the shoulder boards would go on an officer's jacket. So I'm going to say that as far as like the shoulder boards for sure, that's an inaccuracy. Now, Wayne does have on an undershirt. And it's a little hard to tell if this is actually red long johns, like the full body thing, or just a flannel shirt. But later in the movie, they have to cut open the bottom of one of his bottom of one of the legs of his pants, and there is no sign of long johns. So either that is a blooper, or his shirt is just supposed to be a red flannel shirt. Which, if so, that can be accurate. Now, his trousers may not be terrible, though often hard to tell due to he's always wearing a saber belt. Wayne's trousers may or may not have modern belt loops. I actually think they don't, but again, it is hard to tell because of the belt. And if they don't have the belt loops, then they are more accurate than some of the other pants in the film. Now, the yellow stripe on the side seam is correct for cavalry. It is the yellow, but that stripe is actually a bit too wide for what an officer, especially a lieutenant colonel, probably would have worn. Now, he does use suspenders to hold up his pants. Again, like some other things in the movie, it's hard to tell exactly what kind they are. I think they're elastic with the way that he pulls them up and over his shoulder, and he doesn't actually kind of undo them any. They do have a metal release tab on them of a later period, but actually, I'll be honest, while my suspenders for reenacting and living history are not elastic, I have the metal release tabs because they make things much easier. Now, Wayne's boots are supposed to represent a pair of 1860s black boots. Something about them, though, bothers me. Now, they don't have the knee flap, which everyone thinks of when they think of traditional cavalry boots, but that is absolutely fine. Not all boots back then had knee flaps, or if they did, it was just a slight curve. It wasn't the huge flap we always think of, which I personally like and would love to own a pair. And I don't know that much about all the styles and makes of period boots. So this one I'm quite a bit rough on. But something again about bothers me about it. Wayne's to me almost seem to be more of a pair of 20th century riding boots or something possibly also worn by Alice Cooper. Hey, don't get me wrong, Alice Cooper's great. And the picture of Grierson, we actually don't know what he's wearing because his pants are hanging down so far. He could be wearing the lace up brogans, which, if you know what brogans are, they basically aren't that much bigger than a modern shoe and they lace up. Or he could be wearing higher boots and his pants are just covering them. So, but again, something about Wayne's boots bother me, and I feel like it's the look of the leather and how tight they fit. But then again, I don't know that much. Boots back then may have fit that tight. By the end of the movie, not only is Wayne's costume, but all the other costumes look filthy. And I'm going to say that that is well done because they are portraying Union cavalrymen who rode straight down the center of Mississippi, rode hard in dust, probably mud, most likely didn't have time to wash their clothes. And so they would have looked filthy. Matter of fact, when the real raiders reached Baton Rouge, I want to say I read somewhere, don't quote me though, that the Union troops at Baton Rouge actually could not tell at first if they were Union or Confederate soldiers because they were so filthy and ragged. So I'm going to say, well done for the look of being dirty.
Now, in the end, I have to say that Wayne's costume is not authentic. Now, there are items that add to authenticity, such as only 4 buttons on his coat, a pretty decent hat, and possibly no belt loops on his trousers. But there are way too many problems, including his bandana being at least way too small, bib shirt used as sort of a jacket with the shoulder insignia, pant stripes are way too wide, and his jacket's collar. Yet this is still an iconic Hollywood cavalry look, and even though it does not hold up to reenacting or living history standards, it is a really cool looking costume. So with that, thank you for listening to Guide Left, Stage Right.